A sultan's skeleton doesn't lie, even when every historian who ever wrote about him did. In a royal tomb in central Turkey, scientists pulled bone and tooth samples from 12 rulers who governed an empire for over 2 centuries, ran their DNA and skeletal structure through forensic analysis, and discovered that at least one of them had been completely misrepresented by the official record for 800 years, not in some minor detail, but in the exact story of how he died. The chronicles called it an honorable death in single combat. The bones told a different story entirely, and it wasn't honorable at all. This is the story of the Seljuk Sultans of Anatolia, the dynasty whose throne, territory, and Turkic warrior tradition would eventually give rise to the empire that succeeded them, the Ottomans, and how a 6-year forensic project finally cracked open 8 centuries of myth sitting inside a mausoleum in the city of Konya. Before we go further, if you want history checked against hard physical evidence instead of the flattering version written down by court chroniclers, go ahead and like this video right now. It genuinely helps put this kind of research in front of more people who actually care whether the record is true. Let's set the scene properly, because most people outside Turkey have never heard of the Seljuks of Rum, even though their story is essential to understanding everything that came after them. In 1077, a branch of the larger Seljuk Turkic dynasty established an independent sultanate in Anatolia, the peninsula that makes up modern Turkey, carving out territory from a weakened Byzantine Empire following their decisive victory at the Battle of Manzikert a few years earlier. For roughly 230 years, until the sultanate finally collapsed under Mongol pressure in 1308, this dynasty ruled from their capital in Konya, building mosques, caravanserais, and a distinctly Anatolian Turkish Islamic civilization that would directly shape the culture, language, and territory the Ottoman Empire inherited less than a century later. Several Ottoman institutions, and much of the groundwork for Turkish rule in Anatolia, trace back through this exact dynasty. Understanding the Seljuks of Rum is, in a very real sense, understanding the chapter that had to happen before the Ottomans could exist at all. For most of the 20th century, everything historians knew about these sultans came from a small handful of written sources, and one source dominated above all the rest, a Persian language chronicle known as the Musamarat al-Akbar, more commonly referred to through its author's name, Ibn Bibi, a court historian writing decades after many of the events he described. Ibn Bibi's account, along with scattered descriptions from Byzantine historians writing from the opposing side of these same conflicts, became the near-total foundation for how these sultans were remembered. Physical descriptions, causes of death, personal characteristics, all of it came from these second-hand, politically motivated, centuries-old texts, written by men with every reason to shape the story in ways that served their patrons, their religion, or their own dramatic instincts as storytellers. That's an enormous amount of historical weight to place on a handful of documents nobody could independently verify. And for 800 years, nobody really could. The Sultan's remains sat inside the royal tomb attached to the Al-Adin Mosque in Konya, largely undisturbed, treated more as sacred relics than as a source of scientific evidence. That changed in 2017 when Turkish authorities approved an ambitious, carefully managed research project with a formal name that undersold exactly how significant it would turn out to be: the arrangement of the remains at the Konya Seljuk Dynasty Tomb. Led by Professor Mutluhan Tash of Gazi University's Faculty of Fine Arts, working alongside osteoarchaeologist Emel Akpolat and a team of specialists, the project spent 6 years painstakingly reassembling and cataloging skeletal remains that had deteriorated and become disorganized over the centuries. DNA samples extracted from skulls and teeth were sent to the Istanbul Council of Forensic Medicine, where geneticists worked to establish genealogical relationships, confirming father-son and grandfather-grandson lineages directly from biological material rather than from disputed genealogical charts. Remains were also scanned using tomography at Necmettin Erbakan University's medical faculty, mapping bone density, skeletal structure, tissue thickness, and any pathological conditions present at the time of death. The end result, after 6 years of work, was a set of scientifically reconstructed profiles for 12 sultans and 17 royal family members in total, detailed enough that the team was able to build life-sized, anatomically accurate silicone statues, now on permanent public display in Konya. If you're the kind of person who finds it remarkable that modern forensic science can reach back 8 centuries and physically reconstruct a person's actual face and body, this is exactly the project built to do precisely that. Now, here's where things get genuinely interesting, because this wasn't just a facial reconstruction project. Along the way, the DNA and skeletal evidence began directly contradicting details the written chronicles had presented as settled historical fact for centuries. The first correction involved Sultan Kilij Arslan II, one of the most consequential rulers of the dynasty, who spent decades consolidating Seljuk power across central Anatolia during the 12th century. According to Ibn Bibi's chronicle and corroborating descriptions from Byzantine historians, Kilij Arslan II was remembered as a man of notably short stature, a physical detail repeated confidently enough across multiple historical sources that it had simply become accepted fact. When Professor Tash's team examined his actual skeletal remains, the physical evidence told a completely different story. Kilij Arslan II stood approximately 1.83 meters tall, close to 6 feet, a genuinely commanding height for the medieval period, not the diminutive figure historical texts had described for 800 years. Researchers determined that skeletal changes occurring later in his life caused a pronounced stooping posture, which likely created the visual illusion of shortness to observers and chroniclers who encountered him in his later years, an illusion that then calcified into permanent historical record. That correction alone would be a fascinating footnote. But the second finding cuts much deeper because it doesn't just correct a physical detail, it directly contradicts the heroic narrative built around an entire sultan's death. Sultan Kaikhusraw I ruled the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in 2 separate periods, and met his end in 1211 during the Battle of Alaşehir against Byzantine forces. According to Byzantine historical accounts that shaped how this sultan's death was remembered for centuries afterward, Kaikhusraw I fell in a moment of dramatic, honorable single combat, personally engaged and beheaded by an opposing Byzantine knight in the heat of battle, the kind of death medieval chroniclers loved to immortalize as a clash between worthy adversaries. It's a vivid, almost cinematic image, precisely the sort of story that gets repeated, embellished, and eventually accepted as unquestioned historical fact. The skeletal evidence tells a fundamentally different story. According to Professor Tash and his research team's analysis of the actual battle, the Sultan struck down not in a moment of heroic single combat, but ambushed and killed from an angle that suggests he never saw the fatal blow coming at all. In plain terms, the noble, chivalric death that Byzantine chroniclers recorded and that history repeated for 8 centuries appears to have been, at best, a dramatic exaggeration, and at worst, a complete fabrication designed to make an enemy's death sound more dignified and dramatically satisfying than what the physical evidence actually suggests happened on that battlefield. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating that a battlefield legend repeated for 8 centuries could be quietly dismantled by a shoulder blade and a skull fracture, this is exactly the moment that happens. There's a third finding, worth sitting with as well, because it adds a layer of very human tragedy to a ruler remembered mostly for military failure. Sultan Kaikhusraw II, who suffered a catastrophic defeat against the invading Mongol army at the Battle of Kosa Dağ in 1243, a loss that effectively broke Seljuk independence and turned the Sultanate into a Mongol vassal state for the rest of its existence, was found through skeletal analysis to have suffered from a serious genetic condition, a form of rheumatoid arthritis, severe enough to have caused significant deformities in his skull and joints. Historical accounts largely blame Kaikhusraw II's military failure on poor leadership and strategic incompetence, painting him as a weak, ineffective ruler at a critical historical turning point. The genetic and skeletal evidence adds an entirely new dimension that written chronicles never once mentioned, a ruler potentially waging one of the most consequential battles in his dynasty's history while dealing with a painful, physically debilitating chronic condition that court historians either didn't know about or simply chose never to record. Now, it's worth being precise about what this project can and cannot claim, because it would be easy to oversell findings like these into something bigger than the evidence actually supports. First, this research covers 12 sultans and 17 family members from one specific dynasty's tomb, not a comprehensive genetic survey of the entire Seljuk period, let alone the Ottoman Empire that followed it. It's an extraordinarily rich data set for the individuals it covers, but it isn't a complete accounting of an entire imperial family across centuries. Second, some of the project's most striking claims, like the specific circumstances of Kaikhusraw I's death, are being interpreted from skeletal trauma patterns, rather than directly observed events, meaning they represent the most scientifically supported explanation available, rather than absolute, unquestionable certainty. Skeletal forensics is powerful, but it works through careful inference from physical evidence, the same way modern forensic pathologists reconstruct a crime scene, not through a literal replay of history. Third, and this is worth stating clearly, none of these findings involve a sultan turning out to be biologically unrelated to the family he claimed to belong to. There is no paternity scandal buried in this tomb, no secret illegitimate heir uncovered through DNA testing. What was actually uncovered is arguably a different kind of deception, one built not into anyone's bloodline, but into the official record itself, the version of events that generations of historians, students, and the general public had simply accepted as accurate because nobody had the tools to check it against the person's actual remains until now. What makes this project so genuinely significant isn't a single dramatic reveal. It's the quiet, repeated pattern running through nearly every correction the team made. Chronicle after chronicle, written by men with political, religious, or narrative reasons to shape the story a certain way, turned out to contain specific, confidently stated physical and circumstantial details that simply weren't true. A sultan remembered as short was actually tall. A death remembered as honorable combat was actually an ambush. A military failure remembered as pure incompetence may have involved a debilitating illness nobody bothered to record. Individually, each correction seems like a minor historical footnote. Together, they paint a much larger picture about how thoroughly written history can drift from physical reality once enough time, politics, and storytelling instinct get layered on top of it. There's a broader lesson worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond one tomb in central Turkey. For most of human history, the only record we had of powerful rulers was whatever their own chroniclers, or their enemies' chroniclers, chose to write down, filtered through motives that had very little to do with strict factual accuracy. A court historian writing about his own sultan had every incentive to flatter. A rival empire's historian writing about an enemy ruler's death had every incentive to make that death sound either shameful or, in this specific case, elevate it into something more mythic and satisfying than what likely actually happened. Forensic science, applied directly to physical remains, is one of the only tools capable of checking those competing, self-interested narratives against something neither side could manipulate, the actual bones themselves. It's also worth appreciating just how recent this capability really is. For the roughly 800 years between Kaikhosru, the first's death, and Professor Tasch's team examining his remains, there was simply no way to test the Byzantine Chronicles account against anything except more chronicles, more secondhand descriptions, more layers of the exact same storytelling problem. Modern forensic anthropology, genetic analysis, and medical imaging changed that completely, for the first time, giving historians a way to interrogate a centuries-old written claim using something entirely independent of the written record itself. If deep dives like this, where forensic science quietly catches centuries of official history exaggerating, flattering, or simply getting the facts wrong, are exactly the kind of content you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more of this kind of evidence-driven history still waiting to be uncovered. In the end, the Sultans of Konya spent 800 years being remembered exactly the way their chroniclers wanted them remembered. Heroic, where it served the story. Diminished, where it served a rival's narrative. Their true physical selves and true final moments buried under layers of politically convenient storytelling. It took 6 years, a forensic medicine institute and careful analysis of bone and tooth for the truth to finally catch up with the legend. The chronicles told the story historians wanted to believe. The bones, in the end, simply told what actually happened.